The movie begins by introducing us to a soldier named Dan. Dan is on his way to school with his 6-year-old daughter, Casey. While they are walking, Casey tells her father that a boy at school has been troubling her for the past few days. Dan advises her that if the boy bothers her again, she should punch him straight in the throat, which would knock him unconscious. After dropping Casey off at school, Dan goes to his office, where he meets a man named Sebastian. Sebastian already knows Dan very well because they both used to serve together in the Special Forces. After some conversation, Sebastian tells Dan that he has a very good job offer for him and asks whether Dan can spare some time for his old friends. Sebastian then takes Dan to a place where Dan discovers that Sebastian is running a company called CDI, which provides security services. There, Sebastian explains that Dan has to work as the bodyguard of a journalist named Laura. Laura is going to interview Venegas, a dictator who is about to become the president of Poldnia. Sebastian also shows Dan some videos of Venegas. As soon as Dan sees Venegas, he becomes disturbed. Venegas is the same man whom Dan's team was once sent to eliminate. During that mission, all of Dan's teammates were killed, and Dan believes that Venegas was responsible for their deaths. Because of this, Dan initially refuses the job. However, after Sebastian repeatedly convinces him, Dan finally agrees. Later, Dan returns home, where his wife Jenny scolds him. She tells him that Casey punched another child at school because of his advice, and she had to face many complaints from the school. Jenny says that their life already has many problems, and asks why Dan is increasing their troubles even more. The next morning, Dan tells his wife that he is going away for a few days because Sebastian has given him a job that pays a lot of money. Jenny tells him that he should not go just because Sebastian asked him to. She knows the job could be dangerous and says that she only wants a simple and peaceful life with him. However, Dan insists that he must go, and eventually, Jenny agrees. Dan then goes to meet the journalist Laura, and the two of them board a private jet to travel to Poldnia. After arriving there, they see Venegas, who has come personally to welcome Laura. Meanwhile, Venegas's men search Dan and confiscate all his weapons. Soon, all three of them sit in a car. During the ride, Venegas begins talking about Dan, revealing that he knows Dan once worked in the Special Forces and is now acting as a guard from CDI. Dan realizes that Venegas has done complete research on him. As they continue driving, they reach a bridge. Suddenly, the vehicle in front of them explodes, and rebels surround them from all sides and start firing. Their driver is killed in the attack, and Dan immediately takes control of the car. He crashes into the attackers' vehicles one by one, killing many rebels. The identity of these rebels will be revealed later in the story. Dan then steps out of the car with a gun and starts killing the remaining attackers. Once he believes everyone is dead, he goes to the security vehicle, takes out a weapon, and tells Laura that they must leave immediately because the place is extremely dangerous. However, Venegas stops Dan and tells him that he cannot leave and must stay with him to protect his people. Dan refuses and says that saving Venegas's men is not his responsibility. His only duty is to protect Laura. He then leaves the area with Laura and starts moving forward through the jungle. After walking some distance, Laura becomes exhausted and sits down. At that moment, Venegas appears behind them. The three of them discuss who could have carried out the attack. Dan explains that the attack was actually meant for Venegas, and that is why they were caught in the middle of it. Dan then takes out a satellite phone from his bag and calls Sebastian, informing him that they have been attacked and are currently deep inside a jungle, far away from the city. Sebastian tells Dan not to worry and says that he has their exact location. He promises to send help as soon as possible. For now, he advises Dan to move toward the east, saying that the route ahead is clear. After ending the call, Venegas asks Dan to give him the phone because he wants to make a call. Dan refuses. Venegas then says arrogantly that Dan probably doesn't know who he is, and warns that he could easily accuse Dan of being a spy. Hearing this, Dan immediately pulls out his gun and aims it at Venegas, saying that he could kill him in a second right there. At that moment, Laura steps between them and tells Dan that he should give Venegas the phone. Dan lowers his gun and hands the phone to Venegas. Venegas then calls his nephew George. As soon as George hears his uncle's voice, he is completely shocked. That is when it is revealed that George himself was behind the attack on Venegas. Venegas already knew that his nephew was the mastermind and that the rebels had been provoked by him. That is why Venegas deliberately made the call to let everyone know that he was still alive. After finishing the call, Venegas returns the phone to Dan and explains that he already knew his nephew was responsible for the attack and that the rebels were being manipulated against him. He then tells Dan and Laura that they should return toward the capital city. However, Dan refuses and says that the capital could still be dangerous. He tells Venegas that he can go wherever he wants, but Dan and Laura are heading east. Saying this, Dan leaves with Laura. As they continue moving forward, they suddenly notice a helicopter approaching. Both of them feel relieved, assuming that Sebastian has sent it to rescue them. But as soon as the helicopter lands, two armed men step out, and the helicopter immediately takes off again. Dan instantly realizes that this helicopter is not there to help them, and that an attack is about to happen. He grabs Laura and starts running. The helicopter then circles back and positions itself to attack them again. Dan quickly stops, pulls out his sniper rifle, and takes aim at the helicopter while Laura records everything on her phone. Dan fires a precise shot and kills the pilot. With the pilot dead, the helicopter crashes. Laura hides behind a tree, but one of the attackers spots her and moves toward her. Before he can reach her, Dan arrives and kills him. Just then, another armed man appears and aims his gun at them. Before he can fire, Venegas shoots him from behind, saving their lives. Meanwhile, we see George arriving at the helicopter crash site with his men, trying to figure out how his plan failed. At that moment, another vehicle arrives, and a man named Colonel Jan steps out. He confronts George and tells him that his client is extremely unhappy because Venegas is still alive. He scolds George, saying that he couldn't even complete such a simple task and that Venegas should have been dead by now. To make his point clear, Colonel Jan kills one of George's men as a warning and leaves, telling George that this mistake must not happen again. On the other hand, Venegas takes Dan and Laura to a village hidden deep inside the jungle. Venegas tells them that this is his home and that everyone there is family to him. As soon as the villagers see Venegas, they are overjoyed. Venegas introduces Dan and Laura to the village chief and explains that the chief will take them to the town the next day. Until then, they will stay in the village, which is completely safe. Later, we see all three of them bathe, change into clean clothes, and gather at one place. Laura prepares to take Venegas' interview and hands her phone to Dan, asking him to record the video. Laura begins the interview by asking why so many people want Venegas dead. Venegas explains that the land of Paldnian is rich in minerals and rare metals that are essential for modern technologies such as mobile phones, electric cars, and MRI machines. He says that multinational companies want to buy these resources at very low prices. However, Venegas refused, stating that he wants Paldnia to become the world's #1 supplier of these resources at fair prices, so that the people of his country can develop and Paldnia can become a fully developed nation. Because of this decision, Venegas explains, these powerful forces want him dead and are trying to stop him from becoming president. As Dan listens carefully to everything Venegas says, he slowly begins to realize that Venegas is not actually a bad man. Instead, he has been made to look like a villain by powerful outsiders. Later that night, we see Dan, Laura, and Venegas celebrating with the villagers. Everyone is dancing happily, enjoying the moment. After the celebration ends, the villagers return to their homes to sleep. Meanwhile, Laura approaches Dan. She starts praising him and even shows him her tattoo, slowly trying to get closer to him. Dan immediately understands her intentions, but he doesn't give in. He clearly tells her that they shouldn't do this and reminds her that he is only there to protect her as part of his job. The next morning, Dan approaches Laura and tells her to get ready quickly because they need to leave immediately. Just then, Venegas arrives and tells Dan that he is heading to Santiago to secure the future of his people. He asks Dan to stay behind and help protect the villagers. Dan refuses and says that he was sent by CDI for a specific mission, and he cannot risk his life for Venegas' people. Venegas agrees with Dan's point, but asks him an important question. He wonders why CDI sent only Dan when they could have sent someone else. Venegas asks whether this was all part of a bigger plan, or if Dan is simply pretending not to understand. These words leave Dan deep in thought. He steps outside and calls Sebastian, demanding the truth. Dan asks whether he was really sent only to protect Laura, or if there was another hidden objective. He tells Sebastian to be honest with him. Sebastian finally reveals the truth. He admits that Dan was sent with a secret mission to kill Venegas inside his own territory. Sebastian explains that CDI received contracts from multiple countries to eliminate Venegas. Dan was chosen because Venegas was believed to be responsible for the deaths of Dan's fellow soldiers, making this mission a chance for personal revenge. After hearing this, we see Dan pulling out his gun and slowly walking toward Venegas. But when he reaches him, Dan doesn't shoot. Instead, he picks up his bag and tells Laura that they need to leave immediately. At that exact moment, Colonel Jan arrives in the village with his men. Realizing the danger, all three hide. But when Jan starts killing villagers one by one, Venegas can't tolerate it anymore. He steps out, unwilling to let innocent people die because of him. Laura panics and tells Dan that if Jan kills Venegas, he will also massacre the villagers afterward. She urges Dan to do something. Thinking quickly, Dan comes up with a plan. He jumps onto a horse and tells Laura to take another one and move forward. Before Venegas can surrender himself, Dan pulls him onto a horse as well, and all three flee. Colonel Jan's men immediately chase them in vehicles. After some distance, Laura suddenly falls off her horse. Jan's men capture her and take her away. Dan turns back and sees Laura being taken. Dan realizes that rushing in blindly won't work. He says they need a proper plan to rescue Laura and tells Venegas that now is the right time for him to go to Santiago. They continue moving forward and stop for the night inside a church. There, Dan finally tells Venegas that he understands everything now and is ready to help him. Venegas asks for Dan's phone, saying he wants to call an old friend named Edward Lovato, who might be able to help them. The next day, Lovato meets Venegas, and together they create a plan. Through Lovato, they arrange a meeting and lure Colonel Jan to a specific location. Later, we see Dan arriving at that location where Jan is expected to come. Soon after, Jan arrives with his men, and Laura is with them. As soon as Dan and Jan come face to face, both point their guns at each other. At that moment, Jan's men drag Laura forward, and one of them places a gun against her head. Jan then threatens Dan, saying that if Venegas is not handed over to him, he will kill Laura. Left with no other choice, Dan calls Venegas out. But Venegas does not come alone. He arrives along with a massive group of civilians. Their numbers are overwhelming. As soon as they reach the location, the civilians launch an all-out attack on Colonel Jan's men. Completely unprepared for this uprising, Jan and his forces are thrown into chaos and quickly overwhelmed. Dan takes advantage of the situation, and together with Laura and Venegas, he escapes from the battlefield. Venegas then leads them through a hidden tunnel and reveals that it is a secret passage that connects directly to his palace. They soon reach a room inside the palace, where they are shocked to find George sitting there. The moment George sees Venegas alive, he panics. Venegas calmly approaches him and starts explaining the truth. He tells George that Colonel Jan has been using him, and that once Jan's mission is complete, he will kill George as well. Venegas urges him to think carefully and assures him that he has no resentment toward him. He reminds George that he is family and that they should work together for the future of their country. Overwhelmed with guilt and realization, George finally agrees. The two embrace each other emotionally, but suddenly, a general storms into the room. The moment he sees Venegas, he opens fire. The bullet misses Venegas and instead hits George. George dies instantly. Venegas is shattered. He collapses in grief, devastated by the loss of his nephew. At that moment, Paldnian soldiers rush into the room and point their weapons at everyone. Venegas steps forward and addresses them. He explains who the real enemy is and warns them that not only their lives, but the future of their country is at stake. He tells them clearly that he is not their enemy. Colonel Jan enters the room with his men. But before they can fire, the Paldnian soldiers turn on Jan's forces. A massive gunfight erupts from all directions. In the middle of the chaos, Venegas leads Dan and Laura into a hidden safe room and hides them. However, Jan quickly realizes where they have gone and follows them. Suddenly, the lights inside the secret room shut off. Venegas lights a lighter, revealing a hidden door. Using this escape route, all three manage to flee. As they run, Jan's men open fire. Dan tells Venegas and Laura to escape first. The moment they leave, Jan attacks Dan directly. During their fight, Jan reveals the truth. He was the one who ordered the killing of Dan's entire squad, not Venegas. This revelation hits Dan hard. He finally realizes that Venegas was never the real enemy Jan was. Jan tries to stab Dan in the neck with a knife, but just in time, Laura appears and strikes Jan on the head from behind, knocking him unconscious. Together, Dan and Laura rush downstairs. However, Jan's remaining men are everywhere, firing from all sides. Seeing no other option, Dan grabs a gun and begins eliminating them one by one. Laura records everything on her camera, clearly impressed by Dan's combat skills and fearless fighting style. But the enemy numbers are too large for Dan to handle alone. Just when things seem hopeless, Sebastian arrives, crashing through the gate with CDI soldiers. They storm inside and provide backup, wiping out Jan's remaining forces. Sebastian reunites with Dan, and the two are relieved, and happy to see each other alive. In the following scenes, Laura releases all the recorded footage to the news channels. The truth spreads across the world. Soon, Venegas is officially declared the new president. People celebrate everywhere. Venegas publicly thanks Laura and Dan. He delivers a powerful speech to the nation, which is broadcast worldwide. Along with Venegas, Dan is praised everywhere as a hero. Finally, Dan returns home and reunites with his family, feeling a deep sense of peace and happiness. A few days later, Dan receives a message from Venegas saying that he has sent him a gift. Curious, Dan checks his bank account and is shocked to discover that Venegas has transferred $5 million to him. And with this powerful and satisfying ending, the story comes to an end.